Thank you, Ms. Strawson. Mr. Shapiro.
It's an honor to testify. It's an honor to testify before you here today. The reason that I'm with you is that I speak on dozens of college campuses every year, so I have some firsthand experience with the anti-First Amendment activities that have been taking place on the college campuses. I've encountered anti-free speech measures, administrative cowardice, even physical violence at campuses ranging from California State University at Los Angeles to University of Wisconsin at Madison, which is driving the legislation that Ms. Stemmings was talking about, to Penn State University to UC Berkeley, and I am not alone. In order to understand what's been going on at some of our college campuses, it's necessary to explore the ideology that provides the impetus for a lot of the protesters who violently obstruct events, pull fire alarms, assault professors and even other students, and the impetus for administrators who all too often humor these protesters. Free speech is under assault because of a three-step argument made by the advocates and justifiers of violence. The first step is they say that the validity or invalidity of an argument can be judged solely by the ethnic, sexual, racial, or cultural identity of the person making the argument. The second step is that they claim those who say otherwise are engaging in what they call verbal violence. And the final step is they conclude that physical violence is sometimes justified in order to stop such verbal violence. So let's examine each of these three steps in turn. First, the philosophy of intersectionality. This philosophy now dominates college campuses as well as a large segment, unfortunately, of today's Democratic Party, and suggests that straight white Americans are inherently the beneficiaries of white privilege and therefore cannot speak on certain policies, since they have not experienced what it's like to be black or Hispanic or gay or transgender or a woman. This philosophy ranks the value of a view not based on the logic or merit of the view, but on the level of victimization in American society experienced by the person espousing the view. Therefore, if you're an LGBT black woman, your view of American society is automatically more valuable than that of a straight white male. The next step in the logic is obvious. If a straight white male, or anybody else who ranks lower on the victimhood scale, says something contrary to the viewpoint of the higher-ranking intersectionality identity, that person has engaged in a microaggression. As NYU social psychologist Jonathan Haidt writes, microaggressions are small actions or word choices that seem on their face to have no malicious intent, but that are thought of as a kind of violence nonetheless. You don't have to actively say anything insulting to microaggress. Somebody merely needs to take offense. If, for example, you say that society ought to be colorblind, you're microaggressing certain identity groups who have been victimized by a non-colorblind society. Note, microaggressions, as the name suggests, are not merely insults. They are aggressions. They are the equivalent to physical violence. Just 2 weeks ago, psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett of Northeastern University published an essay in the New York Times suggesting that words should be seen as physical violence because they can cause stress, and stress causes physical harm. Thus, Feldman suggested it is reasonable, scientifically speaking, to ban or restrict speech you do not like at your school. This is both inane and dangerous. That's because it leads to the final logical step. Words you don't like deserve to be fought physically. When I spoke at California State University at LA, one professor threatened students who sponsored me by offering to fight them. He then posted a slogan on the door of his office stating, "The best response to microaggression is macroaggression." As Haidt writes, this is why the idea that speech is violence is so dangerous. It tells the members of a generation already beset by anxiety and depression that the world is a far more violent and threatening place than it really is. It tells them that words, ideas, speakers can literally kill them. Even worse, at a time of rapidly rising political polarization in the United States, it helps a small subset of that generation justify political violence. Indeed, protesters all too often engage in physically violent disruption when they believe their identity group is under verbal attack by someone, usually conservative, but not always. Not only do some administrators look the other way, at Middlebury College, Cal State LA, Berkeley, Evergreen, actual crimes were committed and almost nobody has been arrested. But they actively forbid events from moving forward, creating a heckler's veto. The notion that if you are physically violent enough, you can get administrators to kowtow to you, to bow before you, by canceling an event you disagree with altogether. All of this destroys free speech. But just as importantly, it turns students into snowflakes, craven and pathetic, looking for an excuse to be offended so they can earn points in the intersectionality Olympics and then use those points as a club with which to beat opponents. A healthy nation requires an emotionally and intellectually vigorous population ready to engage in open debate at all times. Shielding college students from opposing viewpoints makes them simultaneously weaker and more dangerous. We must fight that process at every step. And that begins by acknowledging that whatever we think about America and where we stand, we must agree on this fundamental principle. All of our views should be judged on their merits, not on the color or sex or sexual orientation of the speaker, and those views should never be banned on the grounds that they offend someone. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it seems to be.
But what I mean by the hard cases is that when you do see a dramatic increase in white supremacist incidents on campuses, university administrators have to pay attention. And particularly when there are people who come from the outside and the university president has a hard time keeping control of her or his campus. But that's a different situation from Mr. Carolla.
Mr. Shapiro, you an agitator?
Not as far as I'm aware. So I think that some of what's been said does mini-skirt the debate. Mr. Krishnamurthy, I got it right. When you were talking about the Wisconsin law, I believe that law was brought up in direct counter to what happened, and it was people talked about it on the floor of the legislature. In direct counter to what happened when I spoke at University of Wisconsin at Madison, where you had a bunch of protesters who stood in front of the stage and obstructed the stage, and then refused to leave. And when I asked the police would they remove the protesters they've been going for 15 minutes. By the way, personally, two things, just to preface. I have no problem whatsoever with people protesting my speeches. I do have a problem with people who won't actually let me speak. And number two, as far as all the talk about white supremacy, I can speak from experience. Mr. Lawrence, your organization named me the #1 target of anti-Semitism online last year. So I have a trophy at my house that says #1 hated Jew in America. So I'm totally familiar with the level of vitriol that's become common in our politics. But one of the things that's a problem, and I think we have to be careful about, is when we say leave it to the administrators, and then the administrators do what they did at UW, which is the police. I said to the police, "Will you remove these protesters?" And the police said, "We have been told by the administration that if we remove the protesters, we are to shut down the event entirely. So we can't remove the protesters." We literally had to wait until they just got tired and walked out, basically. When that's the response of the administration, shouldn't there be some sort of repercussion for that? Because what I'm seeing is a heckler's veto that's taking place on campus. What I'm seeing is people who are not engaging in free speech designed to enrich the debate, but in order to shut down the debate. And there have to be some sort of ramifications for people who are actually committing trespass. I mean, this is not a question of free, everyone is trying to focus in on this term hate crime and hate speech. But the important part of those phrases is not the first word. It's speech versus crime. So if there's a crime that's being committed, we're all in agreement. If somebody commits a crime and they're speaking of an imminent threat to somebody, of course that's a crime. But that has very little to do with the hate and a lot more to do with the crime as to whether that's prosecuted, because hate speech is not prosecutable, nor should it be policed by the campus. So the fact is that what we are seeing is a conflation between speech and active attempts to obstruct in order to promote the obstruction by some administrators on a few college campuses.
Mr. Shapiro, proponents of curtailed speech often argue that certain types of speech amount to violence, noting that certain listeners are emotionally harmed when listening to ideas with which they disagree. There was an article in the LA Times that made this argument, going so far as to call on courts and legislatures to allow the restriction of hate speech as do all other economically advanced democracies in the world. Is there any limiting principle at play where forbidden speech is anything that a particular person or group of people find offensive?
No, I haven't seen any limiting principle at play at all on college campuses, which is the problem. You'll have people like Jason Riley from the Wall Street Journal treated exactly the same way as Ann Coulter or Milo Yiannopoulos, and they're poles apart in terms of how they express themselves and many of the views that they hold. So this idea that there is some sort of bright line, this is why I hate, even the term hate speech is really difficult, because it just suggests that if I don't like what you're saying, or if I impute to you an intent that you may not have, then now you're hateful and you should be banned. It seems to me that it would a more effective use of terminology would say speech I find insulting or speech I find offensive. But the idea of hate speech itself, there are certain types of speech I think we can all agree are objectively hateful, but I don't think that there is any limiting principle at play from a lot of administrators, because I think that they use that club of hate speech in order to cudgel people with whom they disagree. They just say, okay, I don't like what you're saying now, and that's hate speech. And microaggression culture contributes to this. I mean, literally on campuses, students will be told that if you say to another student, "Where are you from?" that this is some sort of microaggression, that this is a minor form of hate speech. If you say, "Where are you from?" because you're implying they're not from here. Well, I mean, of course you're not from here. I mean, I assume you weren't born on this spot, but it doesn't matter. You know, the idea that you're going to broaden out terminology in order to prohibit groups that you don't like or ideas that you don't like, I would much prefer that if we're going to move the ratchet in any one direction, let's move the ratchet in favor of more speech. And I agree, of course, with Mr. Lawrence that it's perfectly appropriate if an administrator wants to say that I personally disagree, the university doesn't agree with the views that are being espoused by a particular speaker. That's perfectly appropriate, but sometimes there are gray areas in terms of what the university is doing. When Mr. Lawrence was at Brandeis University, Ayaan Hirsi Ali was uninvited from the university because of blowback from some of the students. I mean, is that a case of her free speech rights being violated? It's a private university, but if it were a public university, would that be a case of her free speech rights being violated because administrators decided not to stand up for those because students were upset? I mean, this is why I think that the notion that there is some sort of grand intelligentsia running the universities who are capable of discriminating between hate speech and normal speech and should be sitting atop a hill somewhere under a palm tree like a Qadi dispensing justice on a case-by-case basis, I think it's nonsense, and I don't think that they have any rational standards they apply.
Mr. Shapiro, I'm going to assume you don't find this to be a threatening or harmful document.
I've brandished it at a few people myself, yeah.
Look, the college's defense when they arrested these students, by the way, they spent overnight in jail, 7 hours in jail for handing out constitutions. You said something earlier that struck me, that time, place, and manner regulations are being used to restrict free speech, because that's what the college said to these students who belong to Young Americans for Liberty. They said if you just filled out the paperwork, if you'd stood 100 feet over there instead of where you're standing, and if you'd done it at this time, we would have allowed you to hand out our nation's founding document. Can you speak to how time, manner, and place restrictions are being abused?
So most obviously, UC Berkeley did that with Ann Coulter, where they kept moving around her room and they kept saying they didn't have rooms available. They said the same thing to me a week ago. There was some public outcry, and now they're offering some rooms, which I hope that event goes forward. It's not rare. They do this a lot. A private university that did it was DePaul University. I was threatened with arrest if I set foot on campus. I actually showed up there, and a security guard told me, I asked him, if I move 6 inches forward, are you going to arrest me? And he said yes, and he had the sheriff of Cook County behind him. So this is, it's become a cover for ideological discrimination, because if Ta-Nehisi Coates wants to speak on these campuses, there's not going to be any problem. The administrators will make certain that time, place, and manner restrictions don't get in the way. And this is why I say, saying that the discretion of administrators is wonderful is all well and good, except that they very often are attempting to achieve a particular political end by using means that are normally legitimate. And that's definitely a dangerous thing. If you don't mind, I have a quick note on something that I think it was Mr. Lawrence was saying earlier about the damage that's done to students by various things that happen on campus, by threats of violence and this sort of thing. And obviously, everyone, I think, agrees that what happened to Taylor is unacceptable. But one of the things that I think should also be pointed out is we have a lot of other students in the crowd and administrators who spend an enormous amount of time pushing stuff like white privilege means that you must accept that you are subordinate in terms of your view because of identity. This also has some lasting damage with regard to First Amendment exercise and with regard to how people perceive the freedom of the country. And I understand that this is universally held belief among university educators that we have to accept the guilt of particular races or particular sexual orientations for discrimination that's happened in the past. But when you teach a bunch of 18 and 19-year-old people this, you shouldn't be surprised when, number one, they go into hiding with their viewpoint, or number two, they become frustrated. It's an absurdity to suggest that you can tell people that their viewpoints are out of line because of their identity. At the same time, you're telling other people that their viewpoints are completely in line because of their identity, and that any assault on their senses must be protected or prevented at any cost.
Now, it's interesting, Mr. Shapiro, you talked about white privilege, and just this week, I had a conversation with Rachel Lazar, who's done some work, a Jewish American woman who's done some work on this area, as well as having extensive conversations with Dr. Greg Parks of Wake Forest University, who's also talked quite a bit about critical race theory. And it's my understanding that white privilege is not telling individuals that they cannot speak, but it is a term for societal privilege that individuals have as a benefit of their white skin. And I don't think that, and I think universities would be remiss to then say that because you're white, you're not allowed to say anything that's critical of white people. I didn't know that white privilege actually went into that sphere. My understanding is it's just, and the issue is that white privilege makes people uncomfortable to talk about the societal privilege that they have.
Well, to me, what I say on campuses all the time is if you want to cite instances of racism that we can all find and fight together, that's something that I'm more than willing to stand next to you and fight, because that's obviously stuff that we should fight together. But when you just say that there is a white privilege out there in the ether and that by dint of birth your skin color generates for you an advantage, what you're really saying to people is that your view is less valuable because you have not experienced what I've experienced. And that is an identity argument, that's a character argument, that's not a rational political argument that can actually be taken on in any way. It's more of a cudgel and a club than it is an attempt to open a discussion.
Well, I think it's a demonstrable evidence that through society's demographics that being white has societal privileges that being black does not. But
we can
am
talk
very
about how that
interested-
manifests, because that's
I'm
more
also
interesting,
interested in what you just said now, is that you would stand next to anyone who has this. So, Mr. Shapiro, my question to you is, for Ms. Dunston, the tying the noose around the campus and writing messages that target African-American young students, would you consider that hate speech, and then would you stand next to her and fight for her?
As I say,
against that?
this is the first I'm hearing about it, honestly, but...
Really?
But from hearing about it, maybe because it's local, I mean, I'm from LA. But in any case, I'm more than happy to stand alongside her and fight whatever group was responsible for this. Not only more than happy, I mean, you're talking about the alt-right. Again, I was the #1 target of anti-Semitic harassment from the alt-right last year.
Thank
So
you.
I'm more than happy to do all that. And I think there's one more distinction that has to be made. When we talk about cases like Taylor's, they're horrific, and the administration is siding with Taylor. Okay, the administration is doing the right thing by Taylor, or trying to do the right thing by Taylor, as they should be. And I think that we need to make a distinction between cases where the administration is actively participating in the suppression of speech and cases in which the administration is trying to do the right thing in order to punish people for application of crime.
The gentleman.
Okay, Mr. Shapiro, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that. You hear things in this job, people come up to you, and I do believe there are certainly departments on major American campuses in which you can spend, all day walking up the hallways where the faculty work and never be exposed to anybody who voted for a candidate that about half Americans' populace did, which is kind of amazing that you find such, lack of diversity.
Oh yeah, and
anywhere. And I wondered if one of the reasons for the left's rage is because they sometimes do go to work on college campuses and they don't have any friends who even voted for somebody who about half the American public voted for, which is hard to believe there's anywhere in society that kind of cloistered. But I'm afraid on college camp, I wonder if that's one of the reasons why you have this hatred for, say, people who believe in, more conservative half of the American populace.
I think you do have some leftist professors who attempt to, be open to other ideas. I mean, Lonnie Guinier was one of my professors at Harvard Law School, and she ended up writing a job recommendation for me because we got along so well, and she's very far to the left. But that's more a rarity than it is the common thread. I mean, even if you put aside President Trump, the fact is that I think the polls showed that well under 10% of the faculty at Ivy League schools voted for Romney in 2012. So I mean, this has been very consistent, and this is why I think you are seeing some of the violence. When I spoke at Cal State LA, you actually saw the professors calling me a member of the KKK before I got there, and so most of the students had no clue who I was, but they were perfectly willing to go out and protest and beat people up.
Mr. Zimmerman, are you doing anything? I assume your campus, Evergreen, it's got a kind of a reputation.
No.
Are you doing anything to?
We'll come back to that one. We got to move on. I thank the gentleman, and I apologize. We're trying to give everyone a little extra time, but we can't go too much longer. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses. Ben Shapiro, who came up with the thug life, Ben Shapiro?
I have no idea. What me? I have never listened to a complete rap song in my entire life.
It's funny and it's well done. It has some of your greatest hits. Let me ask you. You mentioned the professors. Obviously, the professors overwhelmingly are on the left. Some are fair and want to do. Some are more pushing an ideology. But I wonder. I see some of these things that you've dealt with others. I mean, is it the professors doing this, or are these students just predisposed to do this? It seems like there's a lot of radical students anyways, and a lot of them are kind of going to do this even if their professors weren't egging them on. Is that true?
I think there are three groups. I think there are usually a couple of radical professors who egg them on, not the entire left faculty, because that would be pretty much everyone, but like a couple of radical professors who decide that they think it's worthwhile for there to be massive protests, some student organizers, and then very often lately, you've been seeing people bust in from the outside. So at Berkeley, you saw people coming in from Antifa and integrating with the Berkeley student population, and then doing acts of violence. At Cal State LA, there were a couple of busloads of people who were bussed in. So it's really those three groups, I think.
And when you're dealing with the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel views on campuses, is that faculty-driven, or is that outside the university?
Well, I mean, I haven't dealt with that as much because I think that in the last couple of years, most of the opposition has been coming from the Black Lives Matter movement, from the Bernie Sanders socialist wing of the Democratic Party. It hasn't been coming too much from the Israel stuff, so I don't speak about the Israel stuff all that often on campus. But I mean, the BDS, I know for a lot of Jewish students on campus, it's very uncomfortable because there are a lot of professors who support boycott, divestment, sanctions from Israel and activate their students to do the same.
So just from a conservative perspective, we look at some of what's going on college campuses, and we don't necessarily like it, but we don't really want government involved in a lot of this anyways. But on the other hand, people will point out is we're funding these universities. So the American taxpayer is underwriting a lot of this stuff. So is there a role for government given that we're funding it, or is it just type of thing that, we fund it and we still got to just keep our hands off? If we weren't funding it, then I would think that there would not be a role for the federal government at all. But given, a lot of money is going to these universities.
Yes, I mean, the Wisconsin law that's been discussed repeatedly has been, I think, a little bit unfairly maligned because people are refusing to read the end of the phrase in the law, which is that this is speech that interferes with the speech of others, meaning if you have administrators who are basically handing a heckler's veto to people who are standing up in front of other speakers and then attempting to block it, that's not actually free speech, that's trespass. So I don't know that you need another piece of legislation. I think you do need enforcement of existing law that exists to prevent what is, in fact, criminal activity and not free speech activity. But there's going to have to be some sort of consequences for administrators who don't abide by the current law, because what they're doing is they are essentially saying, we can't shut down the speech, but if you go and you make a big fuss, then we'll say that in order to shut down the fuss, we have to shut down the speech. And if they continue to do that, then I don't see, why federal funding should be going to, I don't see why my taxpayer dollars should be going to a university that bans me because the university refuses to protect my right to free speech.
That's a good point. Now, you talked about the hierarchy of based on identity in terms of who does, and like a white male would be at the bottom kind of deal, but how honest is even that standard applied? Because like somebody like a Justice Clarence Thomas, who obviously has a very compelling background, how would he be received at these universities in terms of his story, given that he's a constitutional originalist?
Right, Jason Riley from the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it's obviously intersectionality and that philosophy is a stand-in for hardcore leftism. And it's just a way of using multiculturalism as the entree to leftist points of view. It isn't actually, as you say, if Clarence Thomas says something, nobody on the left is going to say, well, he suffered as a black man, so his perspective is more valuable than Joe Biden's perspective on a particular issue. You're not going to hear anyone on the left ever say that.
But my guess is at American University, they probably had some diversity training. They probably had some bias training. So maybe this gets to the point Mr. Carolla made earlier. It's not all the bias training and diversity and these tests kids have to take now or students have to take now. Well, let me just go to Mr. Shapiro. Do you think this the bias training is something that is actually helpful?
I don't think it's effective. I think that, in fact, it tends to alienate a lot of the people who feel like, I'm not a racist, why am I being forced to endure the implication that I'm a racist and I have the necessity of undergoing bias training?
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that either Americans get their bias training is not any good, or it's just largely probably not.
People who tie nooses around bananas are not going to be dissuaded from doing so by bias training. They're garbage human beings.
So, Mr. Shapiro, your thoughts on a speech code, or shouldn't it be the First Amendment? Shouldn't that be sufficient?
Absolutely, and I think that we're moving into very dangerous territory when we start identifying speech as violence. And that I think is what's happening more and more often in our politics. I think it's happening on college campuses. When you start saying that what you say offends me to the point where I'm going to treat it as violence, then we are moments away from an actual violent conflagration, and that has to stop immediately.
Do you think, Mr. Shapiro, that some of the things we have seen from the federal government are contributing to the, what I would describe as, crazy situation we see on many campuses, situations you've had to go through and live through. Do you think some of the things that the federal government has done are chilling free speech on college campuses? And specifically, and frankly, what prompted my renewed interest, or greater interest, I should say, in this series of hearings we're having on the First Amendment, was a few years ago when we discovered that an agency with the power and the ability to intimidate and impact people's lives, the agency known as the Internal Revenue Service, was systematically and for a sustained period of time targeting people for their political beliefs. Do you think that has some chilling impact on what may in fact be happening on what is in fact happening on our college campuses?
I mean, sure, when people have an enormous amount of power, whether it's at an administrative level or at the federal level, they tend to use it in ways that benefit the side that they control. And that has to, I mean, I think you've seen this, it's a completely different topic, but I think you've seen this in the context of how a lot of the sexual assault hearings are taking place on campus now, where they're taking place under Title IX auspices, and they don't actually follow any sort of constitutional due process procedures. That's an area where the federal government has gotten involved and really overridden individual rights. And listen, nobody is in favor of sexual assault. Everyone wants to see rapists prosecuted. But we need to come back to some sort of rational standard of application, not just what we wish we could do in some sort of utopia.